The end of isolation. For nearly 3 millennia, ancient Egypt stood as a paragon of cultural continuity, shielded by the unforgiving deserts that bordered the Nile River Valley. This geographic isolation allowed the pharaohs to cultivate an advanced, wealthy, and highly stable civilization that outlasted its Bronze Age contemporaries. However, as the ancient world became more interconnected, this isolation cracked. The very wealth that built the pyramids and temples, vast agricultural surpluses and gold reserves, transformed Egypt from an untouchable superpower into the ultimate prize for a new breed of expansionist empires. Ultimately, the pharaonic state was not destroyed by a sudden cataclysm, but systematically dismantled and wiped out by a succession of predatory nations. The geopolitical landscape of the Near East shifted dramatically in the first millennium BCE, marking the beginning of the end for Egyptian sovereignty. The advent of iron weaponry and the rise of highly militarized, centralized states created imperial machines designed for relentless conquest. Egypt, clinging to traditional Bronze Age warfare and occasionally fractured by internal dynastic disputes, found itself outpaced. The fertile Nile Delta, capable of feeding massive armies and funding imperial treasuries, made the nation a necessary target for any aspiring superpower. The narrative of late ancient Egypt thus became one of desperate defense against the Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. The precursor to these massive foreign invasions actually came from the south, illustrating Egypt's growing inability to defend its borders. In the 8th century BCE, the kingdom of Kush, Nubia, swept northward, conquering Egypt and establishing the 25th dynasty. While the Nubian pharaohs respected and adopted Egyptian religion and culture, their aggressive foreign policy in the Levant drew the attention of a far more brutal neighbor. By provoking the ascendant Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Kushite rulers unwittingly invited the first truly devastating invasion of the Egyptian homeland, setting a precedent for foreign domination. The Assyrian and Persian invasions. The Assyrian war machine, unmatched in its ruthlessness and siege tactics, struck Egypt repeatedly in the 7th century BCE. King Esarhaddon initially breached Egyptian defenses in 671 BCE, but it was his successor, Ashurbanipal, who inflicted a wound from which the ancient civilization would never fully recover. In 663 BCE, the Assyrians sacked the sacred city of Thebes, looting its temples, carrying off its immense wealth, and slaughtering or enslaving its populace. This catastrophic defeat shattered the aura of Egyptian invincibility and proved that the nation's immense wealth could be taken by force. Although the Assyrians eventually withdrew to manage their own collapsing empire, the brief Egyptian resurgence that followed was built on a fragile foundation. The 26th dynasty, known as the Sate period, managed to reunify the country, but their military was dangerously reliant on Greek and Carian mercenaries. This reliance highlighted a fatal demographic and military weakness. The native Egyptian population could no longer field an army capable of deterring the massive empires rising in the east. This vulnerability was fully exposed when a new superpower, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, turned its gaze toward the Nile. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II marched on Egypt, defeating the Egyptian forces at the Battle of Pelusium and initiating the first Persian domination. Unlike the Assyrians who raided and retreated, the Persians integrated Egypt into their massive empire as a satrapy, province. For the first time, Egypt was ruled systematically by a foreign administration that viewed the land primarily as an economic resource to be exploited. Heavy tributes were demanded, sending tons of Egyptian grain and silver eastward to fuel the Persian royal court. The Persian occupation was deeply resented by the native population, sparking a cycle of rebellion and brutal suppression. While Egyptian insurgents occasionally achieved brief independence, most notably during the 28th through 30th dynasties, these victories were fleeting. The Persians inevitably returned with overwhelming force, severely punishing the local populace, pillaging sacred sites, and destroying ancient texts. This relentless attrition drained Egypt's resources, manpower, and cultural spirit, leaving the nation exhausted and desperately looking for salvation from anywhere but Persia. Hellenistic rule and Roman annexation. That salvation appeared to arrive in 332 BCE in the form of Alexander the Great. After crushing the Persian military, Alexander was welcomed into Egypt not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Egyptian priesthood even pronounced him the son of the deity Ammonius. However, this bloodless conquest merely exchanged an Eastern master for a Western one. Upon Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy claimed Egypt, establishing a Greek-speaking dynasty that would rule for the next 3 centuries. The Ptolemaic dynasty created a vibrant, hybrid culture, culminating in the construction of the magnificent city of Alexandria, but it was fundamentally an extractive colonial regime. The Greek elite isolated themselves from the native Egyptian populace, treating the agricultural interior as an immense plantation to fund their Mediterranean ambitions. While pharaonic traditions were maintained in the temples to placate the priests, the ethnic Egyptians were heavily taxed, marginalized in their own homeland, and subjected to systemic discrimination. The wealth of Egypt flowed into Greek hands, further eroding the indigenous power structure. The final blow to ancient Egypt came from the ultimate predatory nation of antiquity, the Roman Republic. As the Ptolemaic dynasty weakened through internal strife and corruption, it became increasingly dependent on Roman military backing. This geopolitical entanglement reached its climax with the fateful reign of Cleopatra VII. Following her defeat alongside Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium, the Roman general Octavian, later Emperor Augustus, annexed Egypt in 30 BC. The last pharaoh was dead, and the illusion of an independent Egyptian state was finally shattered forever. Under Roman rule, Egypt was systematically reduced to a mere personal estate of the emperor, strictly governed to ensure the uninterrupted flow of grain to feed the plebs of Rome. The Romans ruthlessly exploited the Nile's harvests, imposing devastating tax burdens that impoverished the native farming class. Without a royal court to patronize the ancient temples, the traditional priesthoods withered, and the knowledge of hieroglyphs slowly faded into obscurity. Ancient Egypt was ultimately wiped out not by a single devastating strike, but by the relentless, grinding consumption of predatory empires that extracted its wealth, erased its sovereignty and culture.